When you think of Australia, what comes to mind? Maybe ancient rock art? Maybe modern cityscapes? Well, its story is really one of dramatic, constant transformation. So let's dive into how this incredible continent was completely remade. There's a line from our source material that just nails it. Australia is a land which is a mix of that which is appreciably familiar but also totally exotic. That one idea, that constant pull between the familiar and the foreign, it's really the key to understanding its entire story. So this leads us to the big question we're tackling today. How did one of the world's oldest continuous cultures, a place isolated for thousands and thousands of years, become the modern, complex nation we see today? Well, the answer starts a long, long time ago. Okay, part one, an ancient, isolated land. See, before we can even begin to understand modern Australia, we have to get our heads around just how ancient its human story is and how that profound isolation shaped pretty much everything. 60,000 years. Just let that number sink in. That's the timescale we're talking about here. The first people arrived in Australia tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot in Europe or the Americas. For most of human history, it was, quite literally, a world unto itself. And all that time in isolation gave rise to a totally unique way of seeing the world. A core concept for many Aboriginal cultures is the dream time. Now, this isn't a story about something that happened way back when. It's more like an eternal present, where the creation events of the past are alive and shaping the world right now. It's a cyclical view of time, which is completely different from the straight, linear timeline that was common in Europe. And because of this immense period of isolation, Australia became a continent not of one people, but of hundreds of distinct cultures and languages. It was this rich, complex tapestry of societies completely unknown to the rest of the world. But that isolation, it was about to be shattered. And that brings us right to part two, a collision of worlds. The arrival of newcomers from across the oceans would change the continent's destiny forever. For centuries, Europeans had dreamed of this mythical southern land, this Terra Australis Incognita. This timeline kind of shows how that myth became a reality. The Dutch made the first documented landing way back in 1606, but the real game changer? That came in 1770 when Captain James Cook charted the entire East Coast and claimed it for Britain. But why all the sudden interest? Well, Britain had just lost a pretty major piece of real estate, its American colonies. And this created a very, very practical problem for them. They needed a new place to send their prisoners. And so the solution started taking shape in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet. Captain Arthur Phillipps set up a penal colony right at what is now Sydney. But the struggle for survival was immediate and intense. They were dealing with unskilled labor, rampant disease, and the just crushing reality of being on the complete other side of the planet from home. As the colony pushed outwards, conflict was inevitable. These became known as the Frontier Wars. European settlers had a huge advantage with advanced weaponry, and then there were diseases like smallpox, which the Aboriginal people had no immunity to. It had an absolutely devastating impact. Estimates of Aboriginal casualties range pretty widely, from 20,000 to over 100,000. This violent expansion led straight into a period of chaos, but also creation. So let's get into part three, gold, rebellion, and federation. In the 19th century, the raw materials of a new Australian society were really forged in fire. You just have to look at this population chart. Before 1851, the population was hovering under 500,000. Then, gold was discovered, and in less than a decade, as you can see in that second bar, it exploded to over 1 million people. The gold rushes single-handedly turned Australia from a remote prison into a global destination. And with more people, well, you get more tension. The Eureka Rebellion in 1854 is a huge moment. You had miners protesting these crazy expensive license fees and the fact they couldn't vote. They actually took up arms against the government. Now, they lost the battle, but their cause was so popular, it forced massive political reforms. It really laid the groundwork for Australian democracy. By the end of the century, something new was stirring. You had these two powerful forces pushing all the separate colonies together. First, a growing sense of a shared Australian identity, and second, a shared fear of French and German expansion in the Pacific. They started to realize they might be a lot stronger as one. And so, in 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was born. The 6 separate British colonies united into a single federated nation. For the very first time, Australians had their own national parliament and their own prime minister, creating a single identity from coast to coast. But this brand new nation would be tested almost immediately. And this brings us to part 4, a baptism of fire, where Australia's identity was really forged on the world stage. When World War I broke out in 1914, Australia, as part of the British Empire, was automatically in. This was its baptism of fire. It was the first time the young nation was truly tested in a massive global conflict, and it would change the Australian identity forever. The most famous and most formative event was the Gallipoli Campaign in 1915. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, were part of an Allied force trying to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The whole campaign was a brutal 8-month failure, but the shared sacrifice and incredible courage shown there became a foundational story for the nation's character. The total cost was just staggering: 60,000 Australians killed. For a young country with such a small population at the time, it was a devastating loss that left a permanent scar. Which brings us to our final chapter, a nation's modern story. This is where Australia truly comes into its own and finds its place in the modern world. World War II brought the conflict right to Australia's doorstep. The bombing of Darwin in 1942 was a profound shock to the nation. That attack, plus Britain's failure to defend its colonies in Asia, triggered a fundamental strategic shift, pushing Australia firmly into an alliance with the United States. The final, formal break, though, came much later, in 1986, with the Australia Act, which ended all remaining British legal authority for good. It's really the sheer speed of this change that is so breathtaking. In just over 200 years, a blink of an eye compared to its ancient history, an isolated continent, home to the world's oldest living cultures, was completely remade into the modern, complex nation we see today. It is just a profound story of survival, of collision, and of reinvention. And it really begs the question, after a journey this dramatic, what on earth will Australia's next chapter be?